Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. My name is Irina Ålund. I'm a principal consultant at Carbon Limits. And today I also have with me my colleagues from Olivia Wallace from Perspectives Climate Research and Tim Kruger from Carbon Gap. And together we're going to talk about CDR in Norway, and more specifically about the roadmap for deployment of CDR in Norway and which actions should be put in place in Norway in order to CDR to take upscale and accelerate deployment. So today's agenda is, as you see on the screen. When I'm done speaking, I will give the floor to Tim to tell us a little bit about the project background. And after that, Olivia and I will present the results from this very exciting project. And we're going to talk a little bit about the background report that we created for Norway and show you the roadmap itself. And in the end, there will be hopefully some time for some questions and answers, and maybe some of you will want to give some comments. We'll be happy to hear that. Yes, with that, I will give the floor to Tim, who is going to tell us a little bit about the project background. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ira. Good morning. My name is Tim Kruger. I'm a trustee of Carbon Gap, the organization which commissioned the report that is the subject of this webinar. Carbon Gap advocates for the scale-up of carbon dioxide removal to ensure that Europe meets its climate goals. It's a science-led organization, a charity funded exclusively from philanthropic sources. Well, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is essential to achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. It is not sufficient. Stabilized global temperatures will require that we achieve net zero, reducing emissions to a low level and counteracting any remaining emissions with an equivalent quantity of removals. Carbon dioxide removal is the net in net zero. While it's understood that we will need removals at a very large scale, precious little has been done to prepare the ground for what actions need to be taken. The scenarios that have been mapped out through integrated assessment models indicate that to achieve net zero by 2050 would require creation of a whole new sector of the economy to remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the air per year by that date. How many billions of tons per year will depend on how rapidly we can reduce emissions. In 2020, because of the pandemic, we reduced emissions by about 5.5% during that year. It bounced back the following year. But if we were able to achieve that level of reductions in emissions per year, this year, next year, every year, between now and 2050, we would see emissions into the atmosphere fall from just over 40 billion tons per year of CO2 added to about 10 billion tons per year. And that means that if we can reduce the amount of emissions going into the atmosphere, we're going to need to remove the same amount in order to get to net zero. So if we could achieve that level of reductions in emissions year on year, which would take a level of commitment and competence that has never been seen before in the history of humanity. But if we could do that, we would need to remove 10 billion tons of CO2 from the air per year. Building a new sector of the economy to handle that quantity of material is going to be an enormous challenge. What does 10 billion tons of anything even look like? It helps to think of it in terms of something we are more familiar with. Imagine a wheat field, a big one, the biggest wheat field that you can think of. Perhaps you're thinking of a stretch of the Canadian prairies, so pancake flat that, as the locals say, you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. Imagine all the wheat fields in all of Canada. It's a lot of wheat, but less than a 20th of all that is grown around the world. Add in all the wheat from the Great American Plains, from the Russian steppe, from the fields of India and China, from everywhere. Now think of everything that goes into achieving that. Experience handed down through generations. Yields bolstered by decades of research. Fertilizers, pesticides, specialist machinery, regulations, markets, and millions of hardworking farmers, all to put bread on the table. Is that the scale we're thinking of? No. All in, global wheat production is less than 800 million tons per year, less than a tenth of the number that we're thinking of. And that is assuming that all the other plans for cutting emissions go off without a hitch. In reality, we're going to need a lot. We're going to need a plan. And that is what this project is about, developing a plan specific to Norway to understand what it would take to accelerate the deployment of carbon dioxide removal in Norway. Big models give you a top-down view of what is needed. Projects like this give you the bottom-up assessment of what can actually be achieved and how. By the way, you don't have to do all 10 billion tons a year in Norway, but you do have to do a chunk of it there. And Norway is well placed with its forests and energy and places where you can store carbon dioxide. I don't want to steal Era's thunder by telling you what they found, so we'll stop here, except to say a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to the Grantham Foundation, who have funded this report and similar reports in France and the United Arab Emirates to develop actionable plans to accelerate the development and deployment of carbon dioxide removal in those countries. Going forward, we want to roll this model out of country-specific reports around the world. And of course, a huge thank you to the teams at Carbon Limits and Perspectives Climate, who have worked tirelessly and well beyond their brief to deliver this report. Your dedication and commitment is very much appreciated. You've done a truly excellent job. Thank you very much. Back to you, Era.
Thank you so much for the very kind words, Tim. I will now try to share my screen again. Yes, so before we dive into the results and findings of the projects, I mean, that's only a very good, we cannot not take this opportunity to brag a little bit about the teams, the project team. Just a couple of words about Carbon Limits. We are a relatively small climate consultancy based in Oslo, Norway. About 30 employees, a lot of different nationalities, and we speak a lot of languages. And our primary field of expertise is providing consultancy services on various issues and challenges related to climate change mitigation. And whether it's decarbonization of oil and gas systems or carbon capture and storage, work on carbon dioxide removals. We create inventories for example, methane emissions from oil and gas sector, and also work a lot with climate and carbon finance and carbon policies. We do a lot of work on capacity building and perform LCAs and GG accounting, and project development is also one of our work areas. We work mostly globally, maybe not very known in Norway, because the majority of our projects are in fact abroad. More than 400 projects as of today, 100 clients spanning from authorities, public sector, NGOs, private firms, organizations, and so on and so forth. So that's just a few words about us, and I will leave it to Olivia to say a couple words about climate perspectives, climate research.
Yes, so hello everyone. Perspectives have 25 years of experience in climate policy related work, and specifically with expertise in the design of market mechanisms, climate finance, and also national and international climate policy solutions. So actually, the company was founded in 2003, when the first theoretic concepts of carbon markets and emissions trading were actually put into practice. And today the mission is still as relevant as it was then, which is to independently support governments and international organizations, and also the private sector in finding the best solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So as a team, we're multicultural of more than 75 people from 15 different countries. So similar, with very, very diverse backgrounds in terms of academics. And to date, we've completed more than 650 projects and published over 200 publications as well. And specifically in terms of the kind of tailor-made consultancy services that we do, we have done things related to the Paris Agreement, Article 6 mechanisms, the CDM and voluntary markets, national climate policies like the revision of NDCs and implementation, climate finance, climate negotiation support and policy instruments, work to do with adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and also just very close ties to academic research because of university affiliations that we have with the non-profit arm of Perspectives Climate Research. And if we can go to the next slide, just a very brief overview of some selected clients that Perspectives has worked with and continues to do so. Over to you, Arina.
Thanks. Yes, so now we can dive into the project itself. Just a couple of words. Tim already has mentioned about the background for the project, and as he also has said, this work is being done now for 3 countries, like pilot countries, and Norway is one of them, where we, just a little bit about the process, what we've been doing for the almost year. I think we started it almost a year ago. Together with Perspectives Climate Research, we've been working on first to try to understand what are the possibilities in Norway for deployment of carbon dioxide removal pathways, CDR pathways. And that was done through a pretty comprehensive desk research, but also we've performed a pretty big number of interviews with the local stakeholders and organized a national workshop in November 2023, where we invited representatives from academia, industry, NGOs, policymakers to discuss the main barriers and enablers for deployment of CDR pathways in Norway. So as if we talk about products, tangible products from this work, now we have the background report and the roadmap itself that was then co-created together with the national stakeholders, based both on the findings from the background report, but also all the stakeholder engagement that we've been through the last year. If we talk about the CDR pathways that we were assessing in this study, this is what you see on the screen. We've looked into CCS-related pathways, of course, bioenergy with CCS, BECCS, but also direct air carbon capture and storage, DACs. We also looked into nature-based, so-called nature-based solutions, like wetland restoration, agroforestry, afforestation, reforestation. We looked also into ocean-based, as we call them, CDR pathways, blue carbon, ocean alkalinity, direct ocean capture. And we also looked at the pathways related to minerals or mineralization, like, for example, enhanced rock weathering. It's a lot of information here. I won't spend more time going through the whole table, but that's just so that you have the idea of what we started with. And that list was then narrowed down to the pathways that were deemed the most relevant for Norway, and that we'll come back to a little bit later in a second. So the pathways that I mentioned just now were assessed then with regard to 3 main components, and those you see on the screen. The country's physical geography, and that is available resources and infrastructure, policies and incentives in place and planned in Norway, and also social geography. We've used a bottom-up approach for the analysis, especially with regard to the physical geography assessment, where first Carbon Gap helped us to identify what resource requirements are there for different CDR methods. Then we looked at what is available in terms of those resources in Norway, or what is expected to be available in 2030, 2040, and 2050 for some of them. And then easy equation, we put it all together and try to estimate the high-level theoretical potential for CDR in Norway. We used then this potential together with the findings from the workshop and the stakeholder engagement to identify the most relevant CDR pathways in Norway, which we took further in the creation of the roadmap for deployment of those CDR pathways. So if I am to sort of summarize, what is it actually we were trying to answer during this project and during this work? And then it comes down to 3 questions. How much CDR should Norway aim for? What should be the targets? How much can be realistically deployed? So what's the potential for CDR in Norway? And which actions should be put in place in order to achieve successful and rapid development of CDR. And now I'm going to go through all those questions, but I'm going to switch a little bit the order of questions. And we start with how much can be realistically deployed? So what is the potential for CDR deployment in Norway? For those of you who are not Norway, maybe don't know that much about Norway, Norway at a glance, it's a relatively small country with a very long coastline, about 5.5 million inhabitants as of 2022. A very long coastline, more than 100,000 kilometers. And more than a third of the country is covered by forests. The energy landscape in the country is mostly renewable energy. About 98% comes from renewable sources, mostly hydropower. And also Norway is the country with a relatively low, I would say, unemployment rate, about 3.7%. And as we all know, that's also a big oil and gas exporter, number 12 among top oil and gas producing countries. So when we started looking at the physical geography of the country, we were thinking, okay, resources, what should we look into and what should we assess? And what you see on the screen are the resources that we've tried to analyze and estimate basically the amounts, how much of excess energy could be available in 2030, 2040, and 2050 for CDR deployment. Apart from that, we also looked at land resources and various restrictions on land, resources for biomass, and that is sustainable biomass that we focused on. We looked at water resources, predominantly fresh water, minerals. We also had a look at natural conditions, and especially such things as the humidity in the country, temperature, the factors that might be relevant for some of the CDR pathways assessed in the study. And of course, we looked into CO2 transport and storage potential in the country. So in order for me to tell you everything and all the details about all the findings with regard to those resources, I will need more than 1 hour for sure. I told Tim 2 days. Tim, I think 2 weeks would be a more correct estimate. But I will give you just a small sneak peek. All those assessments and results and the numbers are in the reports that we're going to talk about a little bit later today. So as I mentioned, for example, we looked at the land area that might be available for deployment of different CDR pathways. We used GIS, where basically we plotted all the land area in Norway that is committed to something or not suitable for CDR deployment. And then we tried to look, okay, what are we left with? What can theoretically be available for CDR infrastructure or other factors. At the same way, we also looked at the storage capacity estimates in Norway, and we know that Norway is now having several storage projects being under development, but also some of them are very small. And we see that, and we found that the storage capacity on the Norwegian shelf can range from 29 to 86 gigatons CO2. At the same way, we looked also at all the other resources, and I unfortunately don't have time to show you details on those data analysis. Again, in the background report, you can find all the details. But what we found in the end was that land, minerals, fresh water, or CO2 storage capacity are not expected to be bottlenecks for deployment of various CDR pathways. What could be bottlenecks for such deployment are energy or available excess energy and sustainable biomass. So in order to address those uncertainties around energy and biomass, we then went for a scenario-based approach. So what we did, I just show you example on energy, but we also did the same for biomass. We found different projections and done by others on how much energy would be available or is expected to or could be available in the future, and what that energy mix could look like. And we see here, for example, that in 2050, together with hydropower, offshore wind has also potential to become a bigger, larger source of energy in Norway. And then based on those projections, we created scenarios, which we called high scenario and low scenario, when we looked down at the predictions whether the full potential, for example, for offshore wind will be realized, then how much excess energy do we have for CDR deployment? And also low scenario, when we went for more pessimistic projections of the excess energy in the future. And when it comes to biomass, we took an assumption that all the biomass used for some of the CDR pathways would come from, will be sustainable biomass. And the thermal energy that is needed for some of the CDR pathways would come from sustainable biomass. And for that, we also took some projections made by others on how much sustainable biomass we can expect to be available in the future in Norway. So, as I said, we did the same exercise for all the CDR pathways and run them through low and high scenarios. And what you see on this slide is very high level theoretical potential for some selected CDR pathways. And I didn't put numbers on the slide, and it was done deliberately because I think in order for me to show you numbers, I also have to show all the assumptions. For that, I really encourage you to go to the background report and see all the details and how everything was calculated. But I wanted to have this slide here in any case to show you the order of magnitude and to show how those different CDR pathways put in the same line can be compared to each other. You see here the middle circles. They represent this potential for those pathways based on low scenarios, whereas the outer circles, the big ones, those are the potentials estimated for the high, so-called high scenarios. And you see that the difference between the middle circles and the outer circles can be very different for different pathways. For DAX, for example, there might be a huge potential for DAX, and it will all depend on whether the offshore wind potential will be realized by 2050 or not. It's a lot of uncertainty. So based on the estimates of the high theoretical potential, we could then see that, okay, DAX, bio-CCS, and blue carbon actually rank highest among all the various CDR pathways that I showed you in the beginning of this presentation. We see also that biochar can play some role, and there can be some potential around enhanced rock weathering and ocean liming, but I have to say that when it comes to ocean liming, for example, a lot of uncertainty. We found that there was a lot of uncertainty in the estimations. I also think it could be interesting to share with you this exercise that we did with the stakeholders during the stakeholder workshop that we had in November. As I mentioned, we invited participants from academia, research, project developers, policymakers, industry representatives. We put a list of all the CDR pathways that we were assessing in the study in front of them, and we asked them, okay, guys, could you please rank those pathways on a scale from 0 to 10 with regard to how high those pathways are on the Norwegian political agenda as of today? And then the second task was to rank the same pathways with regard to how relevant should they be on the political, or how high should they be on the political agenda in the future? And those are the results of that exercise from the stakeholder workshop. And what we saw is that what the stakeholders pointed out as the most relevant CDR pathways was pretty much in line with what we found when we tried to assess the potential based on the physical geography, available resources, infrastructure, existing policy incentives, and so on. What is also interesting to point out is that some of the pathways were commented by the stakeholders in terms of their permanence and whether they at all can be called carbon removal, carbon dioxide removal. For example, wet restoration and pasture management were viewed more as conservation methods than removals. And when it came to forestry, then various stakeholders pointed out that there might be some issues with permanence of this pathway. So if we look down at this result, basically those are the pathways that in the end we focused on: DAX, BECS, sorry, blue carbon, biochar, and reforestation, forestation. And the roadmap that I will also come back to very soon will also focus on these CDR pathways. I will give the floor to Olivia now, who will tell us about the findings with regard to social geography in Norway.
Exactly. Thank you, Irina. So I will briefly take you through the social geography of Norway. If we can go to the next slide, please. So yes, Norway has a very developed mixed economy with a very high standard of living compared to other European countries. And alongside this, a very robust welfare system. But the Norwegian economy, as Irina has already mentioned, relies very heavily on the oil and gas sector as a source of finance, specifically for this welfare state, through sort of direct ownership of oil fields, dividends from the state interest in Equinor, license fees, and taxes as well. So oil and gas exports actually account for 20% of the country's total GDP. And from 2022 to 23, revenues were predicted to increase by 18%. And this was mainly because the country became Europe's main oil and gas supplier following the EU-wide ban on Russian oil and gas imports. So yes, obviously it's got a very central role of fossil fuels in its economy, but Norway has actually committed to reduce these emissions by 55% by 2030, and this is compared to 1990 levels. Some other initiatives that they've taken on board is the carbon tax rate stands at 51 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And they've also announced that they will actually triple this tax rate to 175 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. So this kind of indicates that gradual increase, obviously, from its current level over time. They also participate in the EU ETS, so sectors like electricity and heat generation and energy-intensive industry like aviation and maritime transport are all subject to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 62% by 2030. But yeah, despite this, oil and gas investments are still forecasted to kind of increase alongside these green investments, which will obviously strongly affect Norway's decarbonisation trajectory in terms of the rate and the magnitude of emissions reductions. And this obviously indirectly informs its CDR pathway in terms of the amount of money that's available for reductions and removals, respectively. Could you go to the next slide, please? That being said, Norway is in a strong position to absorb the costs of climate change mitigation, including carbon removals. So in 2021, Norway's GDP was around $442 billion US, and it emitted around 14 metric tons of carbon. So this means that across the entire economy, around $10,000 US of GDP was generated per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. A carbon price of $100 US per ton levied across the entire economy would amount to $4.1 billion US, which equates to only 0.92% of the total size of the economy. And what I mean by this example here is just showing how much Norway would have to pay in terms of percentage of GDP to actually cover its total CO2 emissions. And this example here is based on 2021 figures and of course based on an increasing carbon price as well. Could you go to the next slide, please? So Norway's public spending remains very high, and this is particularly exacerbated by an aging population and a need for increased productivity in public services. So there's a few factors. High inflation, the strengthening of policies, and a compressed labour market has kind of expects that Norway's GDP growth is to remain at around 1.3% throughout 2024. Also in recent years, there has been a sectoral shift from manufacturing to services, insofar that the workforce now consists mostly of business services, education, health, and social services. According to the OECD, over 30% of Norway's total workforce is actually employed by the Norwegian government, which is one of the highest proportions in the world, and just shows how the public sector acts as a significant source for demand for labour. But it's of this percentage that 6% of the total workforce is either indirectly or directly employed by the oil and gas sector. And again, this is based on 2021 figures. I think what's interesting is how Norway has a specific political interest in attracting labour to the marine sector. So industries like maritime and seafood, where fisheries and aquaculture make a significant contribution, especially to those more sort of coastal remote communities. And it is with respect to this that I think that, it's possible that CDR related activities can gain sort of public support, given the benefits that would be felt at a local level. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit at the sort of workforce in Norway, currently they have an insufficient number of workers with relevant experience. So nearly half of Norwegian companies mention that more technical and engineering skills are needed in the workforce, and specifically mention the need for master degrees. And this is especially required if the country is to develop and deploy CDR at scale. What's interesting, though, is that the rapid growth, we're seeing a rapid growth in demand for green jobs in Norway. So around 26% of Norwegians across different jobs and skill levels perform a job that involves green tasks. So by green tasks, I mean jobs like solar energy system engineers and recyclable material collectors, which is much higher than the OECD average of just 18%. So it's clear that, Norway is kind of their existing base of knowledge and expertise can really serve as an enabling factor for CDR. So the oil and gas sector, for instance, can provide technical competence, especially regarding, CO2 value chains, transport and storage, for example, also in existing oil wells on the Norwegian continental shelf. Next slide, please. We also had a look to understand sort of public acceptance. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine caused a spike in oil prices and kept kind of plans to defund petroleum exploration at bay. And it is with this that new drilling licenses were actually issued in 2022. And really what this does is signposts that kind of how difficult it is still to transition away from the fossil fuel industry, which, like I mentioned, employs 6% of the country's workforce and accounts for 20% of the economy. So it makes this even more difficult to do. Transitioning away from fossil fuels is really a chance for Norway to redirect the workforce currently employed in the oil and gas sector towards CDR. So it does present itself as a good opportunity, since several CDR methods kind of build on that similar technological know-how as oil and gas. I mean, things like operating and maintaining pipelines, the geological storage of CO2 as well, and things like the geological surveying and sampling, monitoring, reporting and verification, and even similar issues to do with safety as well. But yes, public perceptions of climate change have definitely changed gradually in Norway. The population, I would say, is generally very conscious of climate change, but this paradox still exists between recognizing the necessity of climate action and the need for a national oil and gas industry as well. So it's interesting looking into this. The majority of people support further exploration of oil and gas. So you've got about 1/3 advocating for the phase out, by contrast. In a 2018 survey, 67% acknowledged responsibility for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but 52.7% oppose an increase in fossil fuel prices. So it's this dichotomy that really prevents Norway from achieving its full potential with regards to transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards carbon removal related activities. Next slide, please. We also had a look at NGOs. Generally speaking, they are supportive of nature-based solutions, including reforestation, but some NGOs are very skeptical of these. So Friends of the Earth specifically see them as MBS-related solutions as locking in unsustainable practices. So they don't feel that they are an effective climate solution. They themselves have specifically expressed concerns that Norway's CCS plans would actually cause delays in mitigation actions through this kind of over-reliance on technologies that are not yet scalable and to be used in the future. And then you have other NGOs, such as the Bologna Foundation, So these are NGOs, an NGO based in Oslo, are more open to kind of engineered technologies, and have specifically mentioned the fact that, you know, it's not enough to just reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but actually there's a necessity to remove greenhouse gas emissions that are sort of already in the atmosphere. And yeah, Bologna emphasized that kind of importance of using CDR specifically for hard to abate sectors to kind of address those residual emissions, so things like industry. There's also been a sort of complex relationship between landscape and cultural heritage. This has been like a long issue in Norway. There's been a cultural and ethnic conflict with the Sami people, which has been highlighted since the deployment of wind power in Western Norway since 2010, where 2 wind farms were developed as the sort of largest onshore wind project. But the Sami people opposed their installation, as reindeer have been traditionally sort of reared on that land. And in 2021, the deployment of 151 wind turbines on these reindeer pastures were considered kind of this human rights violation by Norway's Supreme Court. Despite this, the wind farms actually remained in operation, which I guess serves to just further deepen that conflict between the Norwegian government and the Sami people. And I think what this shows us is that there's a real need for balancing the development of these climate technologies, potentially including CDR, and their requirements for renewable power with the interests of the indigenous people. And this is certainly to be an area of debate that the Norwegian government really must address. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. So if you remember those 3 questions in the beginning of this presentation, one of them was how much CDR should Norway aim for? So the targets. And here's also an interesting exercise for you guys. So this is what we see here, and also Olivia has mentioned it. So Norway aims to become a low emission society by 2050. That means that all the emissions have to be reduced by 90–95% compared to 1990 levels. We know that Norway, as of today, has not committed to the goal of net zero emissions or net negative, and it's not specified, at least we haven't found any specification of whether any of the country's climate targets will be achieved through CDR. So if you look at this graph, this is a representation of that ambition of becoming a low emission society, reducing emissions by 90–95%, which means that if everything goes according to the plan, and that is the yellow line that you see on the graph, then what we'll have left is from 2.5 to 5 million tons CO2. I think it's interesting to point out also that this graph doesn't include LULUCF. So, for example, for afforestation, they are not included in this in those projections. So, as a policymaker or as a representative of society, I look at this graph and I'm thinking, oh, but it's not that much left, actually, 2.5 million, and that's not even included in forestry. I mean, with forests in Norway, which, as you remember, cover more than a third of the country, we are good to go, right? We don't need to do anything, you might think. But then I want to challenge a little bit that thinking. First of all, there's no guarantee that the yellow line on the previous slide will happen, right? In the perfect world, and we want it to happen, and we want to do everything for it to happen. But again, a lot of uncertainty. No one can guarantee it. And second of all, with this significant potential in Norway for carbon dioxide removal, why not go beyond? Go beyond net zero, remove more CO2 from atmosphere, go to net zero. Just a crazy thought. What about doing some actions to compensate for the country's historical emissions, like what Microsoft is doing now by engaging in different contracts with companies selling credits? Why not to compensate the country's Scope 3 emissions from oil and gas exports? Just a thought. Plus, we've seen that Norway has a huge CO2 storage capacity. So the country could actually become a net CO2 importer and to help store CO2 or remove CO2 in other countries. So our sort of encouragement is to think further and not lock ourselves in this graph and thinking that everything will just happen, we're good to go, but think a little bit further and have high ambitions for the actions required to make the world a better place. So coming back to the last question, the third question in our work, how to achieve a successful and rapid development of CDR. So what should be the means to achieve it? This again, I wanted to show you this this table that is based on the results from our stakeholder engagement and especially findings from the workshop that we had, where we asked the participants to identify the main enablers and barriers for deployment of various CDR pathways. And it's a lot of information. I'm not going to read everything that stands in this table, but what is interesting here is that for all the discussed pathways, the main barriers were identified as absence of net zero or net negative target in Norway, and also absence of clear policy and tax incentives for CDRs, no clear political vision or strategy for CDR, and also, of course, lack of robust MRV systems and regulatory clarity. And that is what we took as a starting point when developing the roadmap for CDR deployment in the country. So when we thought about the roadmap and whether we can break it down to some pillars or some strategic areas, we're thinking that it's important to address both national climate targets and goals, but also identify actions to build up demand for CO2 removals, to scale up supply of CDR, and to build up knowledge and improve and build capacity. So now finally to the roadmap itself, what you see here on the left-hand side, you see those 4 strategic pillars that we identified for the roadmap. And then also you see a estimated timeline, or when things should be put into action. We think that the first and the foremost thing to do is for Norway to set net zero or net negative target for climate policy. Also, given the findings from the stakeholder engagement, and as I've already mentioned, absence of these targets is seen as major barrier for CDR deployment in the country. We think that one of the first steps should be establishment of a national CDR task force, a group of dedicated ministries, organizations who will work on realizing the actions that we propose in this roadmap. And those guys can be led by Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, for example, and otherwise also include other ministries, other agencies, local governments, or maybe even standard organizations and trade associations in the task force. Even though we've looked into potential for CDR in Norway, still I have to underline that it was a high-level theoretical potential. It would be nice to do the analysis of more realistic potential, and that is in order to be able to set good realistic targets for each CDR pathway. Come back to it a little bit later. At the same time, it is important to see, or I know that there's been a lot of assessment done, and some of the stakeholders during the workshop didn't agree with us on those steps. Some of them even said, you know what, it's enough to assess, let's just start acting. We still keep those actions here, keeping in mind that they should happen very fast and go in parallel. So on the supply scale up, we also need to confirm the cost associated with deployment of various pathways and perform a gap analysis of existing policies and incentives, put them towards the cost and see what is not covered, what more should be put in place in terms of incentives in order to scale up CDR deployment. On the capacity building side, we think it's important to have a good communication strategy and capacity building plan for CDR. As I said, all those actions should happen fast, and they should be happening in parallel. So when all these final realistic assessments are done, the plans are set, it is crucial that there are national targets for each CDR pathway. and even that the CDRs are integrated in Norwegian NDC and Climate Action Plan. On the supply scale-up side, it's important to design the financial incentives and support schemes that would cover the gaps between existing support and the costs of deployment of various CDR pathways. And implementation of those incentives should happen pretty quickly. In the previous draft of this roadmap, that box on the implementation was put a little bit further in the future, and then we got a lot of comments from various stakeholders on, no, we have to start doing it now. It's too long to wait 4 years to start implementing those incentives. So we agree, we moved the box closer to today. On the capacity building side, when the plan is in place, it's time to develop capacity building programs, arrange workshops, training sessions for not only policymakers and businesses, but also for general public. And then, of course, when everything is what you see is put in place and the plans are there and incentive mechanisms, support mechanisms are being implemented, we need to see the effect of those actions, right? So we need to design good systems to track the adoption and impact of CDR and monitor key performance indicators of CDR deployment. On the demand build-up, it is important to have good, clear reporting requirements for businesses, not only on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also their scope 3 emissions. It should be very beneficial to have certification labels and mechanisms in place for companies who meet certain sustainability criteria. And from the public sector side, the procurement requirements for public sectors could be essential, crucial for CDR deployment. So on the scale-up side, again, when we implement something, we will need to evaluate the impact of the implemented actions and then make adjustments if we see that those actions are not meeting the targets or our goals. On the capacity building side, it would be important to initiate and support pilot projects for different CDR methods and also plan and host national CDR conferences and expos. And that is not the end of it. You see, there are like still arrows going further into future because we don't think that we should stop there. And I see that there's a little arrow missing here. So nothing should stop there. We have to continue working it. But those are the actions that we see as should be the first priority actions in order to accelerate CDR deployment in Norway. So I'm wrapping up now. Everything what we've presented today with a lot more detail can be found at some point in the background report for Norway and the roadmap for implementation of CDR in Norway. Those will be 2 documents that will go hand in hand together. The English versions of the reports are done and soon will be available, I assume, on Carbon Gap's website, but correct me if I'm wrong, Tim.
That's correct. Yes, they'll be there very shortly.
Yeah.
Is it available now? Sorry, Clotilde has an emergency update that they are available now on the website.
Indeed, it is less of an emergency and more of an exclusive announcement. Now that you have all announced it, the roadmap is available. You can find it on the Carbon Gap website, and it will recap everything that has been said now, but also go into deeper details about the whole process and the vision for Norway. And then the full report, the background report, will be made available within a few days. Stay tuned for that.
Thank you. Thank you. So that was all from our side for today. Thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure, I'm not following the chat or anything. If there are any questions or comments, we'll be happy to address them.
Well, now is your time, everyone, to ask any question you might have. We have one already.
Anna is asking specifically about details on the structure of your process. She asks, how did you define the sustainability of biomass for your research? And then follows up with, does Norway have strict rules on biomass use? And are these similar in the EU?
Yeah, a lot of good questions. So we did not evaluate or rate the biomass ourselves. We used a lot the research and work done by others during that part of the project when we did that desk study. When it comes to whether the biomass requirements for Norway are like in EU, I have to admit I don't feel comfortable answering that. I don't have enough knowledge about that. Maybe, I don't know, Olivia, do you know that? No, but that's indeed something to look into, whether they're similar.
If anyone also has the answers, feel free to type it in the chat. We got another question coming in. Someone asks, Matthias to be specific. So currently, will carbon removal not be a part of the Norway NDCs?
It is not a part of Norwegian NDC as of today, but we hope that it might become in the near future.
Do you know if it's been discussed and then kicked out of the discussion, or was it not even, what's the word, considered as a solution?
I wish I knew what they discussed there behind the closed doors when they discussed NDC. Unfortunately, I don't know whether it's been discussed, not to my knowledge at least, but I might be wrong.
And for anyone who is interested in the NDCs and to better understand what they are, our policy officers at Carbon Gap have put up together an analysis on our policy tracker. So if you go to the Carbon Gap policy tracker, you can find the explanation for what it is, what is every single country doing, how are they sticking to deadlines and such. It's a document that they have to update quite frequently. And we're still waiting on the final versions for most of the European countries. I don't have any other question for now. Is anyone else interested in asking anything? And if not, would you have a moment, or would you be interested in sharing more about the background report that will be coming out soon?
That was the question to me, right?
To the whole team that worked on this, which is why I'm addressing all three of you. How was the process, and how did you put this background report, which is very big? You have to be aware, we are presenting right now, I'm talking to the attendees, we're presenting right now a short roadmap, but the background report goes in depth into absolutely everything that has been explored, because this tool is supposed to be a very strong foundation on which policymakers can rely on, and should inspire other organizations to dive deeper into their own expertise. And I don't know if anyone else has followed our country report journey. We published the same analysis for France not too long ago, though I'm aware it is in French, so not accessible to everyone. But if you visit that same country report page, you can get an idea of the amount of research that goes into these projects. But maybe you would like to present more about your work on this project?
Yeah, yeah, by the way, talking about languages, so as of today, the background report and the roadmap are available in English, but the Norwegian translations are also on their way, so they will be available very soon as well for those who prefer to read in Norwegian. The process was, yeah, it was a lot of research put into this report. That's true what you said, Clotilde, and it's a pretty comprehensive big document. We could try to create a good executive summary for those who don't have time to read 100 pages, but then again, a lot of details there, and a lot of sources of information, and the previous studies have been used to create this background report, which hopefully explains also a lot of what we propose in the roadmap. As I said, I would recommend to take both of those documents and have a read to both of them. Then it will give a better understanding why we recommend those actions, but not some other actions, for example.
Can I just add in here? So part of the inspiration for the design of the project was from the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. They publish renewable readiness assessments, and these are country-level studies which assess what can be done in each particular country. Some countries are going to be better at wind, some at solar, and similar kind of thinking with carbon dioxide removal. And so the work that the teams from Carbon Limits and Perspectives Climate have put in creating that background report is really to understand at a fundamental level what the potential is in the country, and then use that in the engagement with key stakeholders to actually create the roadmap. And that's really important, because the top-down analysis, which is the integrated assessment model saying we're going to need so many billions of tons of removal, doesn't actually talk about the plan of what needs to be done. And it's only by doing this bottom-up assessment, and it's a huge amount of work, and credit to the teams for doing it. It's only by doing that assessment bottom-up that you can actually make a plan. Top-down models say there's this swathe of Africa where you could plant trees, but nobody's ever actually gone and talked to the people who live under that green blob on a map. And really what this project is about in Norway, similar ones in France and the UAE, and hopefully in other countries around the world, is really going and talking to the key stakeholders and the publics in those countries to really understand what can be done. So credit to the team for all the hard work they put into doing that.
Well, thank you. I see that we're coming close to the end of this webinar, and I'm also guessing or hoping that the lack of question comes from people's dedication to reading the roadmap right now. So I don't want to hold you back. Feel free to go read that roadmap. Stay tuned for the publication of the report, and then later on this year, the launch of the same exercise for the UAE, and then in the future, hopefully, the replication of this exercise for other countries. And if you have any question, feel free to reach out to any of you. The Carbon Gap team has their contacts on the team page. And I believe Olivia and Irina are also available if you have any question. And in the meantime, I wish you a good reading on this document. Have a great day, and we'll talk to everyone hopefully soon enough.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.